Look at this cute top. The sleeve ruffles are exquisite. I'm using Simplicity 8602 and I sewed it up today one size larger than I usually make with these commercial patterns, sewing a size 10 instead of my typical size 8. The fit came out great. I'm using 100% cotton fabric today, very easy to work with. This pattern offers a few different views. I chose the shortest length and the gathered sleeve ruffle. There's also a single button closure at the back neckline. Sew this top with me, you'll love the final outcome. Let's get started. Here is the wrong side of my front bodice and I'm going to pin my darts. Now I'll sew both of my darts from the outside edge to the point, leaving thread tails at the point so I can tie them in knots. And press your darts downward. Here is one of my back bodice pieces and I'm going to finish the center back edge, doing this for both back pieces. Place the back bodice pieces right sides together and we'll pin from the dot to the bottom of the back bodice. Then we'll sew from the dot to the bottom of the back bodice with a 5/8 inch seam allowance back stitching at both points to secure. And I've pressed the entire center back portion open, even the seam allowances on either side of the top slit. Now I'm going to finish the shoulder edges for the back piece, as well as the shoulder edges of the front piece. Then I'll place the front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin those shoulders together. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. The pattern calls for a piece of small elastic cord to form the button closure for the back bodice. Here is the top left side of my back bodice with that seam allowance opened out flat. I'll fold my cord in half so that the loop is big enough for the button I've chosen to pass through. I'll place the cord at the small dot transferred from the pattern piece, which should be 3/4 of an inch away from the top edge, and I'll pin the loop in place at the dot. And then I'll baste that button loop in place at the seam allowance. Apply interfacing to the wrong sides of your neckline facing pieces. Then for the back pieces, place them right sides together, and we'll pin in place from the dot to the bottom of the facing. Sew from the dot to the bottom of the facing with a 5/8 inch seam allowance back stitching at both points to secure. And I've pressed the sewn and unsewn portion of that seam allowance open. The memory creases that we press into those seam allowances for the unsewn portion can serve as a stitching guide later. Now I'll place my neckline facings right sides together and pin the shoulder seams. Sew with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Then we want to finish the entire outer edge of the facing. The pattern instructions offer a few options for finishing the outer edges. I'm just going to be using my serger. Now we can place the facing and the neckline right sides together and pin all around the opening and the center backs. Make sure to match up your shoulder seams. Align the raw edges along the center back and match up the large dots where our stitching ended previously. Now that I have my neckline and the center backs pinned, we're going to start our sewing at the large dot, back stitching to secure, and sew up the center back with a 5/8 inch seam allowance, and then pivot around the neckline. At the opposite side of the center back, pivot once again to sew to the large dot where your stitching began, once again back stitching to secure. Now I'll trim those seam allowances in the portions I've sewn. And I'll clip into the curves. And I'll also clip those center back corners. Now we're ready to understitch the neckline and the center backs. We're going to turn the facing over its seam allowance and sew the facing to the seam allowance all around the neckline. As you approach each of those center back corners, your presser foot won't be able to understitch all the way to the corner, so just understitch as far as you can, continuing to understitch also as far as you can down those center backs. Then we can turn our facing to the inside of the garment, poking out those center back corners. Then give those center back edges and your neckline a good press and sew your button across from the button loop. Now for both of my shoulder seams, I want to tack the facing to the shoulder seam from the outside. I'm going to make sure that the outer shoulder seam aligns perfectly with the shoulder seam of the facing on the inside. Placing the needle right in the seam, I'll stitch in the ditch as far as the facing, backstitching at both ends to secure, doing this for both shoulder seams. For the side seams of the front and back bodice pieces, I finished those edges separately. Now I'll place the front and back bodice right sides together and pin the side seams. Sew both side seams with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. To prepare the sleeve to be inserted into the armhole, we're going to sew basting stitches along the top of the sleeve. Using the longest stitch on your machine, sew from notch to notch, leaving thread tails on both ends and doing this for both sleeves. Now that the top of the sleeve has been basted, I've also finished the underarm edges, and I'll fold the sleeve in half right sides together and sew the underarm seam with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open, doing this again for both sleeves. Here is one of my sleeve ruffle pieces, and I'm going to finish both of the short edges. Now both edges are finished, and I'm going to pre-press the hem creases along the top and the bottom before I sew those side seams. For the top of the sleeve ruffle, there's a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and we're going to roll that hem. So I'll press that top allowance to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch all the way across. Once that's pressed, we're going to roll the hem by pressing the raw edge once again, this time to meet the crease, and then we'll roll that top folded section along the first fold line. Now the rolled hem is prepared, and we'll sew this later. We'll prepare the bottom edge as well, folding it to the wrong side by 5/8 of an inch, and then once again folding that raw edge to meet the crease and rolling that folded portion on top of itself to form a narrow hem. Now I'll place the short ends right sides together, and with those hems opened out for now, I'll sew straight across the short edge with a 5/8 inch seam allowance and press the seam open. I've pressed the seam open, and now with the hems on either side still rolled in place, we'll edge stitch close to that inner fold all the way around for the top and bottom hems. I've done this to prepare both of my sleeve ruffles. If you're interested in adding lace along the bottom of these sleeve ruffles, you can sew that along the bottom edge now. Now we're going to sew basting stitches along the top edge of the sleeve ruffle piece. This is the edge with the shallower hem. I'm going to start my basting stitches using the longest stitch on my machine at the seam, stitching all the way around and stopping at the seam on the opposite side, leaving thread tails on both ends so I have threads to pull for gathering. I've gone ahead and finished the raw edges along the bottom of both of my sleeves. Now I'll place the basted top edge of the sleeve ruffle along the bottom of the sleeve, matching the seams so that the wrong side of the sleeve ruffle faces the right side of the sleeve. You want the 5/8 of an inch seam line of the ruffle piece to align with the 5/8 of an inch seam line of the bottom of the sleeve. I'll start pinning in place at the seam line. Then I'll start pulling the basting stitches so that the ruffle fits the bottom of the sleeve. Then I'll continue matching the 5/8 of an inch seam line of the top of the ruffle with the 5/8 of an inch seam line of the bottom of the sleeve, pinning all the way around. Now that I have that ruffle attached to the bottom of the sleeve, and here's what that looks like on the inside. I'm going to sew the two pieces together along the ruffle seam line, doing this to attach the ruffle to both sleeves. Once the ruffle is attached, you can pull out your basting stitches. Here is my bodice wrong side out, and my sleeve is right side out. I'm going to place the sleeve inside its corresponding armhole and align the underarm seams. And pin in place. I'll also pin the top of the sleeve to the shoulder seam, matching the dot with the seam. Then I'll pull my basting stitches on either side of the sleeve cap so that the sleeve fits inside the armhole, and pin in place. Sew around the armhole with a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and finish the raw edges together, sewing slowly and carefully so that you don't catch any puckers in your stitches. Do this for both sleeves. Now to create the bottom hem, I'm going to fold the raw edge to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch all the way around. Once I have that initial fold in place, I'll fold and press it once more to the wrong side by 1 inch. Now that those raw edges are concealed within those folds, edge stitch close to the inner fold all the way around to create the hem. And now your top is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Subscribe to the channel for more full-length sewing tutorials, and I'll see you in the next video.